The Kybalion, what some claim to be an ancient book, is one of the most comprehensive and compact compendiums of spiritual thought in recent memory. Why recent memory? Well, because the Kybalion was actually published and probably written in 1908 by a group known as the Free Initiates. And as most spiritual entities, the origin story gets more blurry as you start to research it. It isn't really known who the Free Initiates are. It sounds like a black metal band, to be honest. And I bet there is one out there that is actually called the Free Initiates. Might as well look it up while we're at it. Anyhow, so people speculate that the Free Initiates were actually just one dude, or like one person. And the dude in question is William Walker Atkinson. And he was an occultist who wrote under multiple aliases such as Pharaon Q. Dumont, I think that's French, I don't know, Ramacharaka, MC Nonviolence, okay, I made that one up, and probably also the Free Initiates. So he had multiple pen names. But again, we do not actually know who wrote this book, it's just alleged. What is undeniable, however, is that the knowledge contained in this tome is absolutely invaluable to the spiritual seeker and researcher. While all the points and principles discussed seem simple to the more advanced students, the Kybalion combines and summarizes the basic spiritual laws of this world into an easily understandable package that can be consumed in under an hour. If anyone would want to start their path towards divinity, the Kybalion is one of the best places to start. What is pretty special about this book is that it basically extracts all spiritual knowledge from several religious books like the Bible, Hinduist and Buddhist texts, the Torah, the Quran, and it lays them out without complex stories and metaphors. So it basically could be considered to be the best instant ramen of religious and spiritual principles. For some it might be too simple as they don't have to do any deciphering themselves, but I think it does a remarkable job at being straightforward while still demanding implementation on the side of the reader. The Kybalion claims, and in my opinion achieves, a culmination of the essence of the teaching of Hermes Trismegistus. Who's Hermes Trismegistus? He is the combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, or Thoth or whatever, who supposedly taught the ancient practice of Hermeticism. Hermeticism is the belief of sealing yourself to contain your energy, using it for more spiritual practices, and accessing higher realms of being or existence. There are a lot of Hermetic writings and a lot of wisdom attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and the Kybalion does an amazing job summing up all of this accumulated knowledge into one single place. Again, did Hermes Trismegistus exist? We don't really know. It's up for you to decide. He's somewhat of an urban legend, you know. As always, one short thing, and I know this could be seen as controversial, but when researching these esoteric things, it is highly advised to skip Wikipedia, as Wikipedia will always be like, bro, that shit's all made up and it's all pseudoscience. So always research these kind of things with a bit more curiosity than usual, and always take everything with a grain of salt. Even when it comes to the name of the book, Kybalion, it is not really known what it actually means. Some claim the name was just chosen to fool people into believing it is an ancient text. Others say it was channeled or passed down. But I say it doesn't really matter, as the hidden wisdom contained within is straight up facts. Okay, enough yapping, as I could make an entire billion-hour video just about the Kybalion and its origin itself. Let's get to the meat. Or for the vegetarians and vegans under us, to the salad of the book. So laid out in the text are 7 major Hermetic principles derived out of the ancient Hermetic writings, such as the Hermetica and the Emerald Tablets, to name a few. These 7 principles are the groundwork of any modern and/or ancient esoteric system or tradition. And I'd even argue that if these 7 principles are not agreed upon by a tradition, that the tradition kind of loses its validity. Okay, hold on. So what does any of this have to do with game design? Well, good question, Jontron. My claim is that the Kybalion not only applies to life itself, but to everything contained in life too. Every living and breathing system benefits from applying the principles contained in the Kybalion. Games are systems, and I'd argue that each game is a little universe in itself, in which the laws of Hermeticism, the principles of the Kybalion, will lead to order, harmony, and beauty. Games that successfully implement the Hermetic principles will end up being timeless, beautiful universes and systems that will carry the harmony and beauty of this universe within. Each of the 7 principles can be converted into principles of game design in order to make better games and in order to make more interesting and alive games. And thus, in the course of this lecture, we will go over each principle of the Kybalion and apply it to game design, so you can make better games, and so you can recognize what makes your favorite worlds and games work, or what makes games you dislike not work. Let's unravel and define the Kybalion of game design. Okay, before we define how the universe works, we need to actually define what the universe is. We will not be able to create a universe if we don't know what the building blocks of a universe are. And the scientific approach to this question is, well, let's just say it changed over the course of the years. We thought the universe is purely physical, to realizing it's actually made out of particles that vibrate and move and shit. I'm not a scientist, I'm an esotericist and game designer, so I will not go too much into detail here about the scientific makeup of the universe, but basically science is coming closer and closer to realizations that spiritual people made hundreds of years ago without a CERN quantum particle accelerator. Okay, quantum physics people will probably hate me for this, but I'm gonna simplify it in the most dummy way possible. What we think about the outcome of an experiment is influencing the actual outcome of the experiment. So basically the observer determines the outcome. If we think the outcome of a particle collision will result into a failure, then it will. If we think it will result into a success, then it will be a success. So how are we influencing the experiment? By our thoughts. So at this point, quantum physics kind of proved that magic is real. The world is thought. The world is mental, which leads us to the first principle of the Kybalion. The all is mind. The universe is mental. And I don't mean it in mental like crazy, but I mean the universe is kind of crazy. Everything that happens is governed by our thoughts. Meaning you yourself forge your own reality according to your thoughts, according to your mind. Which leads us to the classic boo-hoo-woo-hoo statement of everything is consciousness. And thus the ultimate boo-hoo-woo-hoo statement of you are consciousness. And this principle lays down the entire groundwork of every modern esoteric tradition. What you think, and more concretely what you believe in, is real. Even if you don't think it consciously. Some people go as far as saying that we could fly, but our subconscious belief that flying is reserved to certain animals keeps us grounded. So the gravity is a scam. People are actually onto something. So to put this principle into a simple one line, which it actually already is, it's like your thoughts create reality. Or the more advanced, reality is made out of thoughts. We call this type of philosophy mentalism. However, if you try to research it, you will only get articles about mentalists, which are these trick magician kind of people who psychologically manipulate people. This has nothing, or at least very little, to do with the spiritual concept of mentalism. Again, you need to do some deeper digging and searching to research these kind of topics. So if the universe is made out of thoughts, then what is a game made out of? Well, obviously, also thoughts, right? Yes. But we need to translate thoughts into the game engine, or rather into systems in the game. So let's keep it very simple. the game designer is thinking, when you push right on your D-pad, you walk to the right. That's a thought. In order to translate this into the game, we need a thing called a mechanic. A mechanic is a rule in a game. So to define and create our game, we need mechanics. Everything in a game works according to mechanics. Some are more obvious than others, however, but everything is a mechanic. And thus the first game design principle we will look at is all is mechanics. The game is mechanical. Mechanical, however, is a very rigid word, and that's good. The underlying mechanics of our game are supposed to be rigid and persistent in order to create an experience that you can rely on. So when I was saying that some mechanics are more obvious than others, I mean that there are mechanics that we interact with that we don't really consciously recognize. For example, collisions. In Mario, for example, it is defined that Mario cannot fall through blocks. That is a mechanic. We just take it for granted. The same as gravity, which is also a mechanic in Mario, by the way. So we could go a step further and look at the collisions mechanic and see that the game checks if Mario is inside a block, and if that happens, the game pushes Mario outside of the block. This mechanic makes us play the game in the first place, because everything is mechanics. For example, in a shmup, you always move forward, or more precisely, the screen always is moving forward. This is a mechanic as well, even though we do not have any primary interaction with it. What is interesting about video games in particular, compared to a board game, is that the game is a computer computing the mechanics for you. When you play a board game, for example, chess, you are the one computing the mechanics. Another very important distinction between analog and digital games is that in board games, you can actually break the rules of the game. I can make my rook go diagonally, as there's no one computing the laws of the game. A video game, on the other hand, allows and always makes sure the rules and thus the mechanics are not being broken. You cannot break the rules of a video game. A bug or a glitch is simply an oversight of the developer, but not a rule breaker. So a bug is a mechanic that wasn't intentionally designed, or a mechanic that isn't working as intended. So everything a game does and everything you do in a game is according to mechanics. The beauty of mechanics, however, is that they can lead to much greater spaces of freedom than one might think. In game design, we define mechanics which lead to dynamics. So what is a dynamic? A dynamic is a behavior that occurs as a consequence of defined mechanics. However, these dynamics don't have to be inherently designed into the rules of the game. For example, in a FPS game, there is the mechanic of reloading, which momentarily disables the player to shoot and do other actions. What players started doing in accordance is to move behind the wall when reloading. This is not hard-coded into the game in any way and is a dynamic that emerges out of several other mechanics. The smart game designer designs his game in a way that creates interesting dynamics. However, the game is made out of mechanics, so we cannot directly design the dynamics themselves. We need to be careful of dynamics. For example, in Dark Souls, the dynamic of the loot run potentially destroys the well-designed progression of the game. What players started doing is that they started running into high-level areas to loot the high-level gear in order to blaze through the easier areas. This dynamic only emerges because there is the mechanic that you don't drop your loot on death. Of course, it doesn't destroy the game, but it changes it enough to alter the intended experience. Some games, or I'd argue good games, create an infinite amount of meaningful dynamics out of a very few mechanics. such as Minecraft or immersive sims like Deus Ex or Thief. Our goal as game designers is to create a huge possibility space with very little simple to understand mechanics. Good mechanics don't need any explanation and often follow already established rules of the real-life world. There's this concept of primal gameplay, which kinda means that if a monkey can play your game, it is good. Things like shmups, FPS games, Mario, or even Angry Birds are good because a toddler can easily pick up and play the game. I mean, I want to see a toddler clear Katsui, but you know what I'm saying. But for the real gamers, primal gameplay is often too simple, and we need to expand the depth of our game design. And again, this depth is not created by having a lot of mechanics, it is created by having a lot of dynamics. Street Fighter and other fighting games are the perfect example of games that can satisfy both. When I was a kid, I could button mash myself through a fight and still have fun against my friends. Nowadays I know the inner workings of the mechanics and I still enjoy the game. I might even enjoy it a bit more. Well, the dynamics of Street Fighter are immediate to any player. There's a simple mechanic defining a goal: defeat the other player by knocking him out, meaning deplete his health points. Then there are the relatively simple mechanics of pressing a button and an attack coming out. The dynamic of spacing becomes immediately apparent through engaging with these mechanics, and thus a combination of all the available mechanics create a nearly infinite dynamic possibility space. We call this the complexity of a game, or simply depth. As game designers, we need to make sure that our game is complex yet not complicated. So what's the difference? Imagine a gap. The depth of the gap is how much there is to learn, thus its complexity. The width of the gap is how easy it is to access and learn all of that complexity. Chess, for example, it has a gap that is insanely deep, yet also super easy to step over. We basically only need to know how each piece moves. An example where it's looking a bit more different would be a MOBA, for example. In Dota, we need to learn what each character does, how warding works, laning, creep manipulation, and items work, and many other things in order to become a sufficient player. Not only is the gap insanely deep, but it is also a chore to learn, meaning that we have to invest a lot of time into properly understanding and applying such knowledge. The width of the gap is not a bad thing per se, yet we need to accept that it will scare a lot of people off from understanding and enjoying our game. The less complicated, meaning the less narrow our gap is, the more people can be a part of our game. A good game is a gap that is infinitely deep, yet only takes a few seconds to step over. A framework that can help us approach a game is the MDA framework. The MDA framework, standing for Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics, helps us understand how players initially perceive a game. The first layer a player will comprehend are the aesthetics, meaning the emotions a game evokes in a player, or rather the concept that the player immediately grasps. For example, in Street Fighter, just the concept that there's a competition that's tense, strategic, and about martial arts. These aesthetics are invoked by the dynamics, and the dynamics emerge out of the mechanics. The longer a player engages with a game, the further he advances on the framework, meaning that after a while he will understand which dynamics define the game, and lastly, once he's deeply engaged, he will understand the mechanics that create the dynamics. The designer, on the other hand, comes from the other side of the framework, as he needs to establish the mechanics first, which will create the dynamics, and then the aesthetics. Further cementing the first principle of the game design Kybalion, that everything is mechanics. The real world functions in a similar way. We have certain emotions which emerge out of certain behaviors, which are fundamentally governed by the underlying principles of the universe. this underlying principle is thought. If the mechanics of a game are not fun or engaging, the whole game will be dreadful to play, as everything will emerge out of it. The most important mechanic is the mechanic that defines a victory. It needs to be easily understandable and reasonably achievable. The second most important are the mechanics that get us forward to this goal. These mechanics should be simple and reliable, while opening up a plethora of ways to use them. In Mario, the victory mechanic is reaching the end of the level, the flagpole. The mechanics that make us reach the goal are running and jumping and shooting a fireball. You know the deal. However, running and jumping offer up various ways to get to the goal. Especially in 3D Marios, like Mario 64, the running and jumping are so playful and fun that they almost turn the player into an artist, while the level becomes your canvas. And the artwork is finished once you've reached the goal. Good mechanics force us to be creative and expressive, because the mechanics paint the world as all is mechanics. Which brings us to the second principle outlined in the Kybalion, the principle of correspondence. It's the ancient law of as above so below, as below so above. Now this one seems a bit weird at first, but as soon as you start applying it into your own life, you will see immediate results. So for the esotericist, everything is contained in everything. So all aspects of the universe are also inside of each and every one of us. It goes multiple ways. So one way to see this principle is that whatever happens in the physical also happens in higher realms of being, and vice versa. But also what happens inside of us happens outside of us. So if there is conflict inside, there is conflict outside as well. The fact that there is chaos in the world must mean that there is still chaos inside us as people. There's so much to unravel here. So, for example, to show you this principle, if we keep on focusing on the negative things in the world, we will start to embody this negativity inside ourselves. People who constantly watch the news, for example, and only see the horrible things going on in the world will end up being more afraid and in conflict with themselves. People who spend a lot of time meditating and doing good will realize that soon the outside world will follow suit, and the person will be surrounded by good themselves. This principle messes with a lot of people at first because it's so simple, and we have learned to discard simple solutions. Yet the one who truly lives with this in mind will soon realize that it ends up becoming a reality. I could go on elaborating on this, but for now let's keep it at that and discuss how we can apply this principle to game design. One way to incorporate this into our games is by splitting the game into mechanical and visual aspects. A good game has a meaningful and logical connection between visuals and gameplay. For example, a brutal and exhilarating game like Doom needs to represent these aspects in their visual design as well. Imagine that the game would look like a cute Japanese chibi version of itself. It would create a weird uncanny dissonance that doesn't really make much sense. But thinking about it would be kind of sick, but whatever. The visuals need to always correspond to the gameplay or vision of a game. When choosing an art style for something, make it make sense. A statement that always helped me when designing games is the visuals need to serve the gameplay and experience. Emphasis on serve. For example, in a shmup, it doesn't help to make the bullets look realistic, as they become way harder to dodge, like in Battle Garega. They need to be bright and contrasting to serve the mechanic of dodging and movement. Often it is better to think about what makes sense and then think, how can I make the visuals make sense and still look good? The look should never come first. A general guideline is to always split your game into two aspects and then analyze if there's a correspondence or not. A great example are survival horror games like Resident Evil. Let's split our desired aesthetics from the mechanics, for example. If we want to induce the emotion of horror and helplessness, it will not work if our mechanics make us feel overpowered. For example, imagine Resident Evil with unlimited ammo. If there's no fear of running out of bullets, then we will never fear encountering an enemy, as we can just spam our way through every encounter. Another great thing that a game like, I think Resident Evil 7, for example, does it, it makes the conscious choice to limit the field of view of the player. So they split the aesthetics from the graphics, or you could even argue that this is a mechanic, and they made sure that there was a correspondence. The limited field of view gives the player less time to react, plus it invokes a feeling of claustrophobia, which ensures there is a certain feel of unease. Everything in the game needs to correspond to everything else. Good games are holistic experiences in which everything has its right place. I know the term Gesamtkunstwerk, is a meme, but if we want to achieve a game that is timeless and meaningful, we need to master every aspect of our design. If there's one tiny fault in a system, then this will infect all other aspects as well. Another very important area in which correspondence needs to occur is the meta of a game, for example. So the meta are all the things outside the actual game itself that define how a game is played. For example, character selection. If one character is significantly better than another, players will be more likely picking the better character, but they're not forced to. So it is not an inherent mechanic of the game. The meta is mainly created through dynamics, which dictate how a game has to be played in order to succeed. If the meta of a game is flawed, then there is a correspondence in the mechanics. There is a mechanical reason a character is better than others. It's hard to predict the meta without proficient testing. However, if we design our game according to the second principle of the Kybalion, we will not run into the problem of a stale or broken meta. Another very important correspondence is also quality of life in general. Let's say you've designed the sickest trading card game of all time, but the user interface of the deck editor is absolute garbage. This will tarnish the entire game, no matter how good the game is. These problems often occur when a game is made by either multiple people who don't communicate well with each other, or if it's made by only one person who has to do everything and lacks certain skills in some areas. Here the game corresponds with the quality of the team. If there's an issue with the developer of the game, there will be an issue in the game itself. You see, we could continue this analysis further and further and find more and more things that are connected and that correspond, as this principle runs very deep. All you need to know is that a game is an artwork that consists out of multiple components that are working together. If there's a flaw in one, then there will be a flaw in everything else. A game is sort of a mirror of the person who's creating the project. It is a form of shadow work. If something ain't right in your game, you will realize that there is something off within you as well, or within the team that created the game. That's why the perfect game does not exist, as the perfect person does not exist. The good games get really, really close. Everything links together like a beautiful masterpiece. The third principle of the Kybalion is the principle of vibration. So in the book it is written that nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Going back to physics, we now know that the smallest parts of the universe are literally waves moving up and down. Even if something seems still and solid, it is most likely made out of moving parts. The faster something vibrates, the harder it is, and the slower something vibrates, the softer it is. Of course, this is overly simplifying the universe, but let's be real, the universe is pretty simple if you look at it long enough. Even if we think about our body, we are constantly changing, evolving, and becoming. It's pretty trippy if you think about it. It is like the Tao, which is constantly flowing. We need to stay in constant movement to progress, and the one who remains in true stillness will end up dead sooner or later, metaphorically and literally. So how can we apply this to video games? Our goal is to create a world in which nothing is still to ensure that our game feels organic. The obvious analogy is the visual aspects of a game. Ever played a game that just felt like a bit off? Well, it's likely that something that should move doesn't move. I see this regularly with like student projects, for example. Sorry to anyone who's watching. Some assets are simply not animated in any way whatsoever. They're just there, frozen. A simple idle or a breathing animation does wonders to make your game feel more alive. Another thing is that objects that you'd expect to be movable should be movable. Bottles, boxes, pots, etc. Also, if you walk through the world and you bump into something, make it move. If you walk through tall grass, make it move. It is just very weird if something doesn't move. Another thing is that you should make your player be able to do things that he is likely wanting to do. I remember vividly that when I was playing Uncharted and I was stuck behind some cover, as you are 90% of the time in this game, I was seeing a brick laying there. I think it was a brick. And I was like, wouldn't it be sick if I could just pick up the brick and throw it? But I couldn't. Of course, in no way can you let the player do everything, but something as obvious as throwing that damn brick could have made the world so much more alive. It would be another moving part in your system. If you don't want to code the brick throwing mechanic, then just don't put the brick there in the first place. It just begs to be thrown. If it seems like the player could wanna do it, make him able to do it. The more things are interactable in your world, the better. Of course, the meat of the game needs to be good and should be the main focus, but all these little details add an insane amount of life to your game. Think about the Yakuza series, for example. There's no reason for there to be that many minigames. Dart, mahjong, baseball, hanafuda, and so on. They're just there to make the world feel more real, more moving, more alive. Movement is making the world feel alive, and it is what separates the real world from a simulation. We don't have the technical capabilities to make a virtual world as similar as the real world yet, but we can fake it by making everything that should move and everything that needs to be moved movable. To put it more bluntly, everything that stands still is literally dead. If it serves no purpose, the universe will end it. If you don't move, metaphorically and literally, you will kill yourself very fast. Just a thought. So vibration means also like notify, right? In a way that everything is always noticeable, like when your phone vibrates. So even though you have some still parts in your game, they will be seen as still. And this is why this kills a game in the first place. Everything is moving, and thus everything is affecting everything. And another thought, your game needs to be always moving as well. And if it doesn't, it should be still with purpose. I will touch on this later in more detail, but good games don't waste the time of the player. There should be no downtime, or there should only be downtime if it serves a higher purpose. But make the break brief. The individual parts of our game make the whole thing vibrate. It's like a resonating hall. Each part should create a harmonious ambience for the player to bathe in. The fourth principle taught in the Kybalion is one of the most essential in game design. The principle of polarity. It says, everything is dual, everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. Let's dissect this into its individual parts. So in real life, there has to be warm and cold. Warmth can only be felt if we understand the concept of coolness. In order for something to exist, there needs to be the opposite, otherwise we have no means of understanding it. Every light casts a shadow, and where there is a shadow, there must be light. I like to use weapons as a simple, understandable representation for the mechanic principle implied by this law. So in order for a weapon to feel strong, we need to let the player experience a weak weapon first. Symphony of the Night does this clever thing where it gives you your full powers at first and then takes it all away from you. And the fact that we were extremely powerful makes us feel weak at the beginning of the game. And thus we strive to become strong again. It's like this reverse implementation of the law. But if we truly want to design a clever weapon system, we need to give a weapon upsides and downsides. A weapon that is simply good is not interesting as a weapon that does huge attack but attacks really slow. If we create an object with two poles, we will create something meaningful and interesting. Each mechanic in a game needs to have a pro and a contra to make it feel meaningful. If the decision a player has to make is obvious, it is not a good decision. For example, in some shmups, there's a focus attack that deals more damage. However, once we use it, our ship drastically slows down. If there wouldn't be a slowdown, the player would always use the focus attack, and thus it becomes something we call a dominant strategy. Good games make it either so there is no dominant strategy at all, or the dominant strategy is hard to execute, or hard to figure out. In general, we should give the player options, and we should make sure that each strategy has an opposite as well to satisfy the most amount of players. Imagine Dark Souls, but there are only heavy giant swords. The game would become very one-sided. That's why the developers asked themselves, what would a player want to do that hates fighting with a big sword? In general, this is a great approach to making a variety of strategies possible. Imagine a player that really dislikes the thing you are currently developing. So in our example, a player who doesn't mess with huge, big, beefy sword builds probably doesn't like the fact that it is slow. So you give him the option to wield a faster weapon, and in order to implement the principle, make it a polarity. So fast attacks deal less damage. Another thing a player could dislike about the fat-ass swords is the fact that he needs to get up and get close to the guy he's fighting against. So you design a ranged weapon that needs ammunition or mana to work as a polarity. So there's a downside. Polarities make it easy to create an interesting world of possibilities. Of course, these examples are super basic, but they get the message across. Try coming up with up and downs that are not as obvious, such as weapons that transforms into a tiny dagger every 5 attacks, or something crazy like that. Be creative when designing polarities. Okay, so what do you do if you don't want to give the player a choice of weapons? Let's say you really want him to use a specific manner of attack, like it's part of your design. Then you have to give him at least multiple ways to approach an obstacle. See, in a lot of shmups, for example, you only have one thing you can do, which is shoot. But we can make polarities even appear in a simple mechanic like shooting, by, for example, encouraging the player to get up close and point blank enemies for higher points or a small damage boost. So the polarity would be either you stay back in safety and chill, but you miss out on the benefits, or you face the danger head on and get some extras. Generally, we call this risk versus reward, and it is essential in designing something interesting. The higher the reward, the bigger the risk has to be to get it. Make the player do risky stuff. He can play it safe or he can ball, A lot of roguelike games are especially good at offering risk versus reward scenarios. In The Binding of Isaac, for example, you can buy certain items with your HP and heart containers. Same goes for like Revita, which only uses health as a currency. It asks the player to exchange safety for power. The more safe the player plays, the harder the game will be later on. And the more risk he takes, the more powerful he becomes, but it is way easier to die. Again, if an offer is only reward without the risk, then there's no question asked. You just take it. It is important to make these decisions, however, something that doesn't interrupt the flow of a game. A small criticism of mine for Isaac is the fact that very often the item management and resource juggling comes in the way and stops you in your tracks. Not really, but mentally. What helps is if you give the player a certain time limit, for example. Let's say the offer would disappear after a few moments, forcing you to make the decision fast. The auto-scrolling of a shmup is such a measure, for example. Also, it's important to not make a decision into a math exercise. The player should learn through experience which weapon he prefers, or is better. If you calculate the damage per second for your dagger and your hammer, and then you decide, oh, the daggers are actually 0.8 hit points stronger if you use it for a minute, then there's no decision in the first place again. You should obscure some of this knowledge and some of these values, or make weapons identical in certain regards to balance things, because as the principle describes, opposites are identical in nature but different in degree. And also it says extremes meet, so make an extremely slow weapon extremely powerful, and so on. And to remember, this cannot only be applied to weapon types, it has to be applied on every mechanic. Another concept that is important is the idea of the polarity overflow. When we reach a certain extreme, it starts to feel as the opposite again. Like and unlike are the same once again. When there's too much light, we will be blinded and can't see, as if we would be in darkness. When it gets extremely cold, our skin starts to burn, just like when touching fire. In some cases, people felt so much pleasure that they literally couldn't take it anymore. Tickling is kind of like that, you know? The same principle applies to games as well. A lot of open world games suffer from the problem of becoming mundane after the player has reached a certain level. Sure, we feel a sense of satisfaction by dominating an area, but if we constantly dominate, we will get bored. We need to enforce rhythm, and more on that later. An amazing example of a game where devs avoided this, and it backfired though, is Oblivion, where they completely screwed up the progression system. So in Oblivion, some enemies, or maybe even all, I don't know actually, get better and stronger when you level up. The devs thought that this is a surefire way to keep the player engaged by making the challenge scale with your progression. But it ends up tiring the player and encourages leveling up as rarely as possible. We need to experience polarities in every aspect of a game, which brings us to the next principle. The fifth principle is probably one of the most overlooked, and I constantly see devs get this wrong, or not caring about it at all. The book states the following: everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. So I think I don't really have to go in detail about the real-world implications of this, but to put it bluntly, if you experience one polarity, for example sadness, the other extreme must follow suit and come afterwards. So in this case, happiness. This is simply pure logic. It goes down until it eventually goes up again. However, the Kybalion and most spiritual teachings make it pretty clear that there is a rhythm to everything, and extreme swings to the left will become an extreme swing to the right, and mild swings to the left will be mild swings to the right. Everything is a wave, and thus everything is swinging back and forth, just like the principle of vibration states. Now we know, combining these two principles, that everything vibrates in a predictable rhythm. Theories like the fourth turning also show how history always unfolds in the same rhythms. It's a simple analysis, but let's be real, life is simple. Making games, on the other hand, is kinda tough. In my previous video, I was talking about flow. And flow is exactly what facilitates a good rhythm. We let the player overcome a challenge, then we make him feel strong for a bit, and then we hit him with a new harder obstacle. All of this while the overall difficulty is steadily increasing. If we throw challenge after challenge after challenge at the player, he will be overwhelmed, and the experience will be a chore. However, we need to keep the downtime brief. And as the law of the pendulum implies, make the swing of downtime the same length of the swing of challenge, never longer. A huge problem in modern games is that you have a 1-minute combat encounter and then they make you walk, climb, solve random crappy shitty puzzles and other stuff for 10 to 20 minutes. All of this filler downtime drags the entire game down. Shmups, for example, are excellent in giving the player short bursts of chill time, while the boss does his wake-up animation during the patterns or throwing popcorn enemies at you just to cool the heat. All these examples are excellent ways to hide your downtime. Also, please, for the love of God, make the downtime make sense in context of the game. I'm currently playing Castlevania Lords of Shadow for another video. And why do I have to solve a ring-turning puzzle after a fight? How does this have anything to do with Castlevania, the story, setting, or anything? It's awful. Don't make content to just have content. Remember the principle of correspondence. A good way is also to let the player choose how much or how long his downtime will be. Like in roguelikes, how you can just chill in the boss room for a bit until you go to the next floor. We naturally tend to act according to hermetic principles anyways, so we regulate our own time and make it uniquely enjoyable for us. Another rhythm that is omnipresent in games, especially role-playing games, is the Skinner box. So the Skinner box was an experiment with a rat, and it goes like this. There's like a button, and when you press it, you get a reward. And then they'll increase the amount of presses needed for the next reward. And they do this after each drop of Yangi sugar crack juice or whatever they gave the rat. The amount of presses exponentially increases. So the first reward comes after 1 hit, and then the next one after 2, 4, 8, 16. You get the idea. So what they found out is basically the rat will keep on pressing the button as it remembers the hit from the reward. And I hate to break it to you, but most games are like this. And they do this to get you hooked. First few hours you unlock new things left and right, but then slowly the stuff starts to get spaced out more and more and more and more until you see new shit every few moons, you know? A lot of people dislike this kind of design, but I really enjoy it if it is done well. The first things first, don't make the Skinner box obvious. Level up gauges, for example, already indicate that this will be a Skinner box. Make it a bit more hidden in plain sight. Then I highly suggest varying the reward intervals. Make the player have a burst of rewards and then give him a drought. Basically make the Skinner box present but varied, like fill-ins in a drum loop. A lot of roguelikes have this already figured out in their meta progression. In Revita again, you'll steadily gain new things that you can unlock, but once you reach a certain goal or finish the boss for the first time, you unlock tons of new content at once. It's unexpected and like uncovering a new game inside the game itself. The rhythm is still there because you know that you will get something, but you don't know how much you will get of what at which time. Combining the rhythms of flow and the Skinner box make for a delightful progression. And you really have to implement the Skinner box in a hidden, well-made way. It always helps to see games as songs, for example, or albums when designing them, because rarely does music just throw a thing at you once and then never again, you know. It gives it to you several times in a predictable manner, and that is what makes music enjoyable. Good and interesting games vary their rhythms, but never drop the groove. And when they do, they bring it back with a sense of purpose and grandiosity. It's like a crescendo. The sixth principle of the Kybalion is the principle of cause and effect. And it goes like this. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for a law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. Essentially, this is a basic concept of karma. Whatever you do will come back at you. but also everything you do does something. Even if you think it might be a trivial thing, like giving a tip or picking up a penny, it will have wider implications on life and all of the universe. The buck you gave the waitress will cause a chain of events which will end up in you receiving something as well. The penny picked up from the floor might be the penny that saves you from being shot because it was a thick-ass penny. I don't know, something like this. But you get the idea. Most people simply live their life and not think much about what they're doing, not realizing that they just missed an opportunity to give. What goes around comes around, basically. Another implication of this law is that if something happens to you, there is a reason. There are no coincidences. If there is an effect, there was a cause. In games, we need to account for everything the player does and change the world accordingly. Everything you do should change the game in a meaningful way. There's this definition of game which goes like this. A game is a series of meaningful decisions. And this is a very important thing to account when making games. Is this decision meaningful? If it doesn't have an impact on the game, then why bother? Take cosmetics, for example. It can be something small, like looking differently, but even better is if it also changes the gameplay. In Elder Scrolls, for example, choosing your starting race not only changes your appearance, but it also changes your stats, skills, and even how people end up treating you in the game. Thus it becomes a meaningful decision. In most games like Dark Souls, for example, the first initial cosmetic player creation doesn't change a thing. You might as well just randomize it and go. The starting gift and class, on the other hand, is a meaningful decision, as it actually has a cause and an effect. If there's simply a cause but no effect, then don't put it in the game. At minimum, make it have the effect of making the game more alive, like walking by grass and making it move, for example. The effect there is immersion. Examples of bad implementations are, for example, dialogue options that don't change anything. In a lot of old JRPGs, they give you options to answer, but they don't even change what is being said afterwards. So that's not very interesting or meaningful. But we need to apply this to everything in our game. For example, I recently was making a shmup in Shmup Creator, and there was the option for pickups that are being dropped to automatically home towards the player. Seems like this doesn't really change much, right? Well, I found out that if the drop doesn't home towards the player, he actually has to go there and get it. And suddenly, the route through my levels changed drastically. It created this tension of, should I pick it up and change my route, or should I just chill and forget about it but stay in safety? Every design decision causes an effect and changes everything in the design of the game. The way your ship controls, for example, in a shmup, dictates the entire flow of the game. If there's inertia or velocity curves in your movement, then all the bullet patterns need to be designed according to this initial mechanic, and that's really awkward. Another important thing to discuss is positive and negative feedback loops. A positive feedback loop rewards you for doing well and punishes you for being bad. A negative feedback loop balances things by giving the player in first place worse items, for example, like in Mario Kart. Competitive games should generally always opt for positive feedback and casual games for negative. The best, however, is a good and reasonable combination of both. In Dota, for example, you lose money if you die. Not only makes this the player fear death and make them play more seriously, but it also encourages the other team to beat up the opposing carry to halt his economic growth. If there wouldn't be an effect after death, you could simply run into the enemy area over and over again and harass them without ever fearing any punishment or effect. I remember that death was so punishing in that game that often people just quit over being killed in the first 5 minutes. If there would be no effect, we wouldn't even talk about this mechanic. Another thing to implement this could be scoring. Make the player gain score for everything he does. Staying close to the enemy, points. Killing an enemy fast, points. Being fast? Points. Finding secret rooms? Points. Then take it a step further and give these points an effect as well. As for example, points can be used to unlock characters or unlock new things. Constantly go over your design and look, does this do something meaningful? Where does the cause and effect chain end? Good games are circles in which everything corresponds. You cannot traceably find an end in the chain. In Star of Providence, for example, picking up health when having full health will upgrade your max HP. Picking up bombs when you have full bombs gives you cash. Cash can be used to buy new weapons, and overriding an old weapon gives you cash, health, and maybe even a bomb. Never is there a point where an item doesn't do anything, or anything yet. Again, in Lords of Shadow, this game sucks so much, but not in that game in particular. Sometimes enemies drop daggers, but when you have full daggers, you simply can't look at them and they have zero value. Or maybe I should just use more daggers, but you get the point. Make your items do something at all times. Every cause should have an effect in a game to make the world feel alive and interconnected. It's a lot of work to implement, but it is worth it. Same goes for audio. Everything your player does should make a unique audio to make the world feel alive. I can't stress this enough. Modern collectathon or Ubisoft open world slop games have this problem in spades. What good are the 300 symbols on the map if nothing on it really does anything? Simply filling a list of objectives with ticks is not good design. It's content for the sake of content. People shit on games like Vampire Survivors and then go and play Assassin's Creed 69 or something, which is basically the exact same thing but hidden behind more layers. Give things meaning and let everything have an effect. And now we finally reach the last principle, which is the most controversial in the book. And on Storygraph, which is the site I use to track my books and reading, the original Kybalion even has a trigger warning because of it. So take it with a grain of salt and remember that when the Kybalion was written, it was a different time. I'd read it in a more progressive way, but some people still get triggered, so take that in consideration. So the last principle mentioned in the Kybalion is the principle of gender, and the following is stated. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. So in spirituality, we usually use the traditional dualistic view of gender, meaning there's masculine and feminine. Masculine is considered as the active force of the universe, aka the sun, and feminine is the passive force in the universe, represented by the moon. However, what a lot of people get wrong, and this is where people get upset nowadays, is that active is not better or superior than passive. They are equal. Both have positive and negative attributes. And furthermore, a woman is not inherently passive and a man is not inherently active. Read the principle as it is written. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Whether men are more likely to be active, that's a debate I don't want to go into here because this video is not about that. The far more interesting aspect is that anything in the world consists of part active and part passive principles. The ideal is to have both parts in balance and to lean into the right mode of being at the right time. So I also want to point out that passive does not mean complete stillness, as the principle of vibration implies. I'd rather explain these two things like this. Passive is vibrating in space, and active is vibrating towards something. Both actions are equally as important. A person or thing that is only active or passive is detrimental to our universe. So how do we apply this to games? I'd like to start with active and passive mechanics. It's a vague term, but I'll try my best to explain it. So the first thing is that active mechanics are everything that requires an input from the player, like moving or making a decision. Passive mechanics are all things that move by themselves, like health regeneration, money gain, and other economy, or the movement and behavior of enemies. The best games are games in which your active mechanics and actions influence the passive ones. Like actively choosing an armor that passively changes your stats. And here's where the beauty of this starts to manifest, as your active decision changes the passive aspects of a game, and the passive thus influences your active behavior again. So it's a loop. So here's a simple example. You choose an armor set that increases your health regeneration, and thus you start actively playing more aggressively, because the passive aspects of the armor change your playstyle. Those kind of active-passive loops can be found all over video games. Ideally, when designing a mechanic, we need to make it so it meaningfully influences all these two aspects. Just a few examples to get your gears going and to make us think about it. An example of a passive-heavy game would be most tower defense games. You place your towers, which are active decisions, and then you press run and you let it happen. This is a pretty passive game with very little active input. Basically, to make it even easier, think of the passive component as everything that the computer or the game controls for you. A game without anything active is no longer a game. An interesting edge case are like idle games, as it is literally the name of the game in this case. Cookie Clicker is mainly passive, if you ignore all the crazy shenanigans they added later on, but it kind of breaks the magic circle and makes the waiting an active part of the game. It's really wild. So a completely passive game would essentially be a movie. However, a movie doesn't have passive mechanics that can be manipulated by active engagement, which make it not a game. So are there any games that are completely active? I'd argue that chess, for example, is completely active. There's nothing that is being manipulated by a computer. You could argue that the initial board state is a mechanic that is passively creating the whole dynamic of chess, but I'd say that this is just a neat thought experiment. The problem with turn-based active-only games is that there is no intuitive actions. You don't have to react to card draws, dice rolls, or object placements randomly generated by the computer. Chess is solely skill-based, which to me is also not really interesting. There's always the best move somewhere to be found. Drawing cards is passive, as there's nothing you can change about it. However, it uniquely affects the way you play every time, as you have to adapt to the cards you've been dealt. When we have to manipulate or calculate random or passive aspects of a game, then we enter an interesting territory. War games with dice, for example, are great, as you have to work around the fact that it either will be a hit or not, and you have to work around the chance of failure. This is an example where active and passive work in perfect harmony. And when you have to account for multiple outcomes at once and choose a path that covers the most ground. When playing Street Fighter, we can see the other player as the passive for us also, and we are the active part. However, we are the passive part in the game for the opponent, and they are the active part for themselves. And this resolves the principle of gender, making both players have both passive and active aspects at once. It's beautiful. The beauty of timeless games is when we intuitively and actively have to adapt to uncontrollable and thus the passive unknown. However, the sun should never fully reveal what's on the dark side of the moon, and the moon can never completely cover the shine of the sun. And there we have it. The 7 principles of the Kybalion, and how to use them for analyzing and designing games. And pretty much anything in life. Remember that this can be applied to basically everything. Movies, books, art, comics, text, music, love, life, whatever you want. Every principle is active in everything. And to make something resemble the perfect, harmonious world, it must become harmonious itself. To find meaning and structure, one must simply apply to life the game design Kybalion.